Thank you very much to ACSS for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm honored to try to fill in for Dr. Philip Astin, who unfortunately couldn't come. He's a tremendous scholar of Islam in northern Nigeria, and he has many, especially collections of primary source documents online, which I really encourage all of you to look at if you have a history in northern Nigeria. Just for disclosure, as Dr. Siegel said, I'm currently seconded to the Department of State. The remarks that I'll give today are based on my own academic research and my own perspective, and I don't speak for the Department of State, and the views that I give today aren't necessarily reflective of the views of the department itself. The structure of my presentation today is based around trying to strike a balance between what I would call a macro level perspective on the drivers of Boko Haram and a micro level perspective on the drivers of Boko Haram. And I think it's important to try and balance those two perspectives and to try and connect the dots between them. And in that way, I really hope that what I have to say will build on both what Professor Payton and Professor Kobo said. I was asked in particular to try and give a forward-looking view about other kinds of violent Muslim movements that might emerge in northern Nigeria in the future, especially given that some of the macro-level drivers are likely to stay in place. So I'm going to try to give a forward-looking view and offer some ideas about policy solutions in the future for future movements that might emerge. But to give a forward-looking view, I also want to look back a little bit, especially at I think the key period of Boko Haram from maybe, especially around 2009, but maybe from 2007 to 2011 a little bit, and try and talk about some of the logic of Boko Haram. When I talk about a micro-level perspective, I'm especially talking about close analysis of what happened, even on sort of a day-by-day level. I'm talking about a close analysis of who participated, and then a close analysis of what these groups actually say. And if we can look at what they say, maybe we can get at a little bit of what they believe. Though, of course, assessing what people believe is a tremendously slippery question. So to turn to the kind of macro level explanation, and I think here I'll be recapping what others have said. Some of the long-term trends that might contribute to producing Boko Haram include northern underdevelopment, unemployment, population growth, which creates some of the potential constituencies for violent Muslim movements, endemic corruption, which generates anger at authorities, and of course, lowers the quality of life for Nigerians across the country and dilutes the quality of governance and so forth. Another driver is abusive behavior by security forces, which generates mistrust of police and the military. There's the fragmentation of religious authority in northern Nigeria and a crowded, maybe we could call it a religious marketplace, where different people are competing to get their message out. And I think the crowdedness of that marketplace creates incentives for different religious actors to adopt particularly strident messages. And I think we can look at Mohammed Yusuf, in some sense, as one of those actors in that marketplace trying to compete for followers. All of those trends, economic, political, religious, cultural, I think are likely to continue. And I think the constituencies of unemployed and embittered young men will likely remain available to aggressive religious entrepreneurs. I think it's worth noting, too, that these problems aren't confined to the Muslim community. And I think we can look at other kinds of movements in the country as maybe expressions of anger at the political deal or the economic deal or the problems of corruption in other parts of the country. So those are some of the macro level factors that I want to point to. But I think that, again, I think it's important to connect some of the dots between the macro and the micro level. So for example, sometimes people will assess northern political frustration with not having a northern president as part of the drivers of Boko Haram. And I think that has certainly contributed. I think it's also important to point out, though, that Boko Haram began, or at least the 2009 uprising occurred while there was a Muslim president from the north in office. So I think it's important to again, go back to the details of 2009 and assess exactly what happened. So just to give some examples of micro-level things that I think are important to pay attention to. So in 2009, the clashes between Boko Haram and the police, I think, were extremely important. There was a program in Borno State called Operation Flush, which was a police program that aimed at getting highway robbers off the road and so forth. And the story at least goes that that there were a series of clashes between Boko Haram or the proto-Boko Haram and forces from Operation Flush that escalated over time. There was one clash when Boko Haram members were on the way back from a funeral for one of their comrades, and they were stopped by police, and there was violence that broke out. And then there was a series of sermons by Mohammed Yusuf, and then, of course, the uprisings of July and August 2009, which came, in some sense, in a response to these crackdowns as part of Operation Flush. And I think that those kind of things, and if you look at Mohammed Yusuf's sermons from the time, and then if we look at the killing of Mohammed Yusuf, from my view, I think Boko Haram in part regards itself as the victim of state violence rather than the aggressor. I think it's important to try and look at, again, some of these micro events to try and get inside the worldview of Boko Haram and try and understand where they see themselves as coming from. Then another sort of micro-level factor is the murky micropolitics of the Northeast. I'm not going to sit here and accuse individuals by name of Northeastern politicians by name of supporting Boko Haram, but if you look at the Nigerian media carefully, there are persistent allegations that come up of politicians in the Northeast supporting Boko Haram, and there have been people. There was one senator from Borno State who was brought in for questioning by the SSS. And so I think that in understanding Boko Haram, it's important to try and parse out as well as possible who was involved and who supported Mohammed Yusuf in the pre-2009 phase, and what the connections were with the local political scene. Also in 2011, I think it's worth pointing out that in the lead up to the 2011 elections, there were a series of assassinations in the Northeast of Northeastern politicians that were attributed to Boko Haram. And again, it seems that there was some connection between local political contestation for power and Boko Haram's activities. And I think those connections are extremely important to attend to. Then I think another micro-level factor that's worth paying attention to are some of the specificities of Boko Haram's religious worldview. And I think some important work has been done on this recently. There's an article in the Journal of Religion in Africa from the summer issue of 2012, written anonymously, that I encourage everybody to take a look at, that gets into Boko Haram's worldview and debates among Nigerian Salafis in depth. And the article argues in part that Boko Haram's worldview has been partly caricatured, and that there's a lot more. If we sort of look at pamphlets that were circulating that Mohammed Yusuf wrote, there's a lot more to that worldview that can be understood and understood with nuance. And then Jacob Zen has also done a lot of work starting to translate some of the sermons of Boko Haram and so forth. And I think it's really important to look at what Mohammed Yusuf in particular said. I think it's insufficient to just talk about Salafism or to talk about Salafi jihadism or to talk about extremism, in part because there were so many debates within the Salafi arena in northern Nigeria, including between Mohammed Yusuf and other prominent Salafis. And this is one of the things that I'll get into in a moment when I talk about approaches to avoid. I think it's important to avoid a blanket sort of condemnation of Salafism or a blanket assertion that Salafism inexorably leads to violence. So these are some of the micro-level factors that I think are important to understanding Boko Haram, and one reason that I'm dwelling on them is that I think in preventing or assessing future movements, I think it'll be important to try and identify them and think about how to grapple with them when they're in an embryonic stage. I think that in the future there are likely to be future movements. I think it would have been much better if the situation with Boko Haram had been handled in 2009 in a different way. I think things could have gone much differently. And I think that I think from a lot of people's perspective, they seem to just come out of nowhere. But I think there were things that Nigerian authorities or that international authorities could have paid more attention to in the run-up to 2009. So here are some approaches that I think should be avoided in trying to assess some of those movements in the future. I think we should avoid, or policymakers in general, American and international policymakers, should avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. And this comes back in part to the theological issue. So we'll hear sometimes that the Maitatsine movement of the 1980s was a precursor to Boko Haram. I think that's true in a demographic sense. I mean, if, from the limited amount that we know about Maitatsine and the limited amount that we know about Boko Haram in terms of recruitment patterns, it seems that both of them drew on down and out young men in cities, especially graduates of Quranic schools. So I think demographically there's a similarity between the two movements. In theological terms, though, they were very different. I mean, Maitatsine was what's sometimes called a Quran-only movement, where they rejected the corpus of hadiths. The corpus of hadiths is almost the essence of Salafism. Salafis would find the theological position of Maitatsine completely anathema. Also, the stance of Maitatsine toward technology, they even rejected things like bicycles. It was a real sort of Luddite movement. If you look at Usman Khan's book on Izala, there's a long section on Maitatsine that I think really breaks down their worldview well. And I stress the differences between Boko Haram and Maitatsine in part because I think that if there's a future violent Muslim movement, it could look very different from Boko Haram. So the assumption that the worldview of Boko Haram is going to be the worldview of the next movement, I think would be mistaken. In line with that, I think that it's important to avoid kind of a simplistic demonization of Salafism and an exaltation of Sufism. If we really rewind the historical tape and we go back to the colonial period, British colonial authorities were extremely suspicious of certain Sufi movements and considered them sort of the radical subversives of that time. I think if we think about that, then it really puts sort of some of the current suspicion of Salafism in perspective. We read many sort of accounts now about how Sufism could be a force for counter-radicalization, or how Sufis are always peaceful and moderate and tolerant. And then you look back at the colonial period and the language is, in some cases, just the opposite. And the colonial authorities sometimes talked about Sufism as the main transnational or translocal threat of their time. So I think it's important to relativize our perspective about what Sufism and what Salafism are. Then I also think another approach to avoid is killing leaders, especially killing leaders in an extrajudicial and in an extrajudicial fashion. I think that the situation with Boko Haram could have gone differently and maybe better if Boko Haram had not been killed, if Mohammed Yusuf had not been killed in the way that he was. I think that if Mohammed Yusuf had been detained and had received a fair trial, and if he had received sort of due process of law, I think things might have gone actually much differently in the end. And I think that'll be important to bear in mind. I think that security forces in the future should try to avoid martyring militant commanders and instead try to seek to bring them to trial. Then those are some of the approaches that I think Nigerian and American and other authorities should avoid. I think there are a few or many current U.S. approaches that are on track. The government of the United States has consistently urged the Nigerian government to adopt a comprehensive and more broader approach to insecurity, one that doesn't just focus on military crackdowns in the Northeast, but one that focuses on respect for human rights, a real attempt to give detainees the due process of law, really try to process people through the legal system in a way that's fair and that's accurate. Try to adopt an approach that really gets at some of these macro level factors, really gets at some of the core grievances and problems in the North. And so I personally was heartened to see President Jonathan's announcement on his trip to Gombe of a Northern Development Scheme that would try to address some of these problems. And so now, of course, people will be very keen to see what fruit that initiative bears. I think also a U.S. approach that's on track is just working simultaneously on multiple time horizons. So looking at how to try and reduce terrorism in the short term, looking in the medium term at how to try and promote peaceful and credible elections in 2015, and then looking at the long term at how to help the government of Nigeria address some of these problems of northern underdevelopment. So there are initiatives by USAID in Bauchi and Sokoto states. There are other programs, of course, the British DFID has a number of programs trying to improve governance at the state level in northern Nigeria, and I think a lot of those initiatives are extremely promising. And then, just to close, I want to outline a couple of new approaches that I think are worth considering, and this gets back to sort of my core argument here, that I think it's worth trying to pay attention to the specificities of groups at the embryonic stage and trying to think about ways to monitor them and to try and deal with the situation appropriately at that stage. So I think that, just to reiterate, I think that analysts missed a lot on the road to Boko Haram's emergence. Things like the assassination of Sheikh Jafar Mahmoud Adam in 2007, who was a rival Salafi leader in northern Nigeria, somebody who had spoken out against Boko Haram, somebody who had directly debated with Mohammed Yusuf. I think that was one flashpoint. I think the vitriol of Mohammed Yusuf, the clashes between Boko Haram and Operation Flush, all those were sort of warning signs on the road to the uprising of summer 2009. And then, of course, there were the clashes in 2003, 2004. And so I think there were warning signs on the way. I think in the future, it'll be important for Nigerian authorities and for Friends of Nigeria to try and identify some of these movements at a more embryonic stage. And I think that's not just limited to Muslim movements. So I'll give one example. There's a militia coming out of the Igan ethnic group in Nasarawa state of Nigeria called Ombatse, neither a Muslim nor a Christian movement. And the worldview of that movement and its activities and everything remain very murky to me. But from what I've read about sort of large-scale clashes between the Ombatse movement and authorities in Nasarawa state, I think this is an example of one of these embryonic movements that I think could be a cause for concern. And I think once these movements are identified, then Nigeria and its partners can devise different strategies, law enforcement strategies, civil society strategies, diplomatic engagement strategies to try and prevent violence before it becomes more widespread. Two other ideas, and then I'll wrap up. One is in line with my point about not demonizing Salafism. I think it's important to engage a wide spectrum of religious leaders. I think it's important to look in engagements with religious leaders in Nigeria beyond some of the figures that first spring to mind. I think the hereditary Muslim rulers continue to play a tremendously important role in Nigerian society, and I don't want to discount them. But I think that keeping in mind the spread of Salafism, I think that it's important to look for Salafi interlocutors with whom Nigerian authorities or the U.S. government or other people can have a productive conversation. So whether that be leaders within Izala who've spoken out against Boko Haram or other members of the Salafi community, people who hold high positions in state office, I think some of those people can offer credible and compelling interlocutors for the Nigerian government or other governments. I think that engaging some of those people would give greater insight into religious dynamics in Nigeria, and it would give Nigerian authorities and Friends of Nigeria a broader network of interlocutors to call on in times of crisis, broader network of people to talk to. And then finally, I guess to return to the macro level, I think it's important to take grievances seriously. I think that each violent movement has its own specificities, but I think ultimately Nigeria and its partners will need to alleviate some of the social and political trends that contribute to violence and radicalization. I think that means creating jobs. I think that means reducing and hopefully ending corruption. It means improving governance at the state and the federal level and the local level as well. I think it means cleaning up the environment. I think it means reforming the security forces and the judiciary, and then ensuring that politicians are accountable to their constituents. So, thank you.